A warm welcome to everyone. Again, wherever you've dialed in from, it's just good to be with you. And thank you for your commitment to pray for Langham. And just want to introduce our special guest for this evening UK time, and that's Paul Windsor. Paul, great to see you. And I know lots of people will recognize you probably and know your name and what you're up to and where you fit in Langham. But tell us where you're speaking from and what's the sort of family position and all that background. Mhm.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the call and for all those that are gathering as well. Yeah, so I'm coming to you from the future in Auckland, New Zealand, where I've just had breakfast and live here in West Auckland with my wife, Barbie. And this is where I was born. And we have five children. Four of them here in New Zealand, one of them living in South Asia. And so we enjoy the season of life, a lot of focus on the children and the grandchildren at this stage.
Mhm. And how long have you been there? Lived in the house you're speaking from?
Speaking from
You,
summertime.
you weren't
We
born
first
in it, yeah.
the family home is in another suburb, but this house actually we were in when I had a period of time on the faculty of what's called Laidlaw College some years ago. So we'd had about 10 years based in India, and then COVID, and we've been staying here since then.
Yeah. Great. You somehow came to faith that the Lord met you. Is there
Yeah,
a story there? What's your coming to faith? Yeah.
yeah, both Barbie, my wife, and I were raised in missionary families in North India, so we grew up with that kind of heart and focus. I think my faith journey, I always resonated with someone who described it as the dawning of the day rather than a lightning strike. And I think that would capture how I would feel. I remember recently being in New Delhi and going to a place where we used to meet as a church when I was 10, 11, 12. And it was quite moving to go back because we had an evangelist from Canada who was the pastor. And I think I gave my life to Jesus every Sunday evening over a period of 2 or 3 years. And there was
Hallelujah.
that sense of commitment and recommitment as he gave an appeal each week.
I think the New Testament is very interesting on that, isn't it? You know, we've got Peter and Paul, and as you say, a lightning strike. We know when Paul gave his heart
Yeah,
to Christ or was challenged. You know, it was shortly after noon on a journey to Damascus, and he could probably take us to the time and place. But it's a very interesting question. When did Peter become a Christian in
yeah,
our sort of
yeah,
terms?
exactly.
So we get that model. Now, at some stage from there, you came across the work of Langham.
Yeah. So um, I was on the board when Langham New Zealand was formed. And very soon after it was formed, uh, a a little job description came into the attention of the board where Jonathan Lamb, the founding director of Langham Preaching, was looking for an associate, um, particularly to work alongside him, but also to help get the work moving forward in Asia and the South Pacific. And so that was my first real encounter. And when I showed this job description to family and friends, there was obviously a real striking alignment with who I was and how the Lord had shaped me. And so we were immediately interested. And then in God's goodness, I think it was only about 2 weeks later that Chris Wright was on one of his visits to New Zealand. And he and Liz, good friends with my parents, who drew Chris and Liz into All Nations all those years ago when my dad was the principal there. And so I would catch up with Chris a bit, and we went off to a coffee shop that morning. Chris probably remembers, and talked about the role, and then things happened very quickly. Actually, from there, I think the Lord was already loosening the soil where I was, and I was longing to get back into work that took me among the peoples of the world. And one thing led to another very, very quickly. And I think by June, I had resigned from my other role and was looking forward to joining Langham. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Can you give us some idea of the scale of the operation you now direct? What is Langham Preaching about? What's its shape and size? Can you describe it to us?
Hmm. So I think our little purpose, excuse me, our little purpose statement would be to nurture movements of biblical preaching in countries around the world. And so those movements are heart language movements, they're grassroots movements. We try to have them locally owned and locally operated. We try to avoid a kind of a franchise sort of model and become too prescriptive. And I think where they fit is a kind of a complement to what the colleges and seminaries do around the world. We would be particularly set aside for those that can't reach, or colleges and seminaries don't reach them easily. And so that would be our particular passion and sense of call. And then these movements, they're they get moving and gain momentum and spread and grow through primarily two different features. One would be the multiplication and equipping of local trainers and facilitators right where people are. So the local facilitator, and then the other would be the small group. We find that it is in a small group that transformation tends to happen. And so it's the multiplication and um, growing effectiveness of local facilitators and small groups by which the work spreads. Yeah.
And you're, I think we quote a number of something like 100 to 120 different countries or language groups or whatever. Is there a current sort of size number in your mind or? Yeah.
Yeah, and those different features to it. I think the preaching movement number is, I think the last number I saw was 117, and these would be in about 100 or 101 countries. Some of the larger countries, we have multiple preaching movements for different reasons. So those would be those numbers. The preaching clubs or the small groups, I think it's about 1,400 around the world now. And the local facilitators, a little bit harder to measure, but I think that's around 700. So these would be the numbers that represent the way the work carries forward. Yeah.
I mean, those are extraordinary numbers in terms of a majority world reach and impact. I mean, do you have any? I mean, if any of us were to turn up to either one of those groups, can you describe what it would be like in a group and where it's come from and where it's going in
Well, I think
general?
within the small group, they're called escuelitas in Latin America and ushirika in Africa. They are small. They're sort of 6, 8, and in a given monthly meeting, you would have there would be someone preaching, and there would be some kind of feedback, or we don't talk about evaluation, we talk about adding value. So there would be some kind of discussion around how the sermon went. There would be praying. We, with the help of Langham Literature, produce books that these groups read through, and there might be some discussion of a chapter. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that would happen in a small group. And then those small groups gather usually annually for a training seminar where new skills are added that can then be practiced back in the small group in the following year. Hmm.
Well, it was a privilege to join an escalator very briefly in
Yeah,
Colombia. And I
yeah.
thought that as they acted out what they did and shared, these are fairly, I was going to say brutal, that's unfair, but fairly assertive and direct feedback on what people have prepared and stuff. And I'm sure I see quite a few nods around the screen of people thinking, gosh, can they come to our church and can we get a chance to assess and to encourage to improve and whatever? Um, so Okay, so what's your role in all of this? I mean, that's a massive work. Tell us about the leadership team. Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm in the role of program director, and the focus is really for me on what we call our global leadership team mentioned in the prayer points. So there's a group of about 10, and they're really on the ground the leaders of the work. And so my role with Ruth Slater in the UK and Maggie Samir in Egypt, we kind of convene that GLT and facilitate it and kind of lead through it as they then take responsibility for things, out where the work is. So the key members of the global leadership team would include the directors of each continent, and they each have their leadership teams. And I think increasingly it is the continental leadership teams where the real leadership of the work is going on at that more local level. Yeah, so that's primarily my role, is to um, support and care for lots of Zooms, those people on the GLT, and yeah, just to care for them basically. Mm.
So, from your perspective, if you step back a bit and just survey the sort of global momentum or whatever at the moment, what's your feeling when you look down on it all? Mm. How's it going?
Um,
How does it feel? Mm.
yeah, I think it's going well. I think that the comment that we often make to each other is, it's just amazing how God keeps bringing us good people,
Mhm.
where we don't ever seem to lack. And then I think my real joy in the work is when we have those people on board, is to work with them, watch them grow, give them more responsibility. And so in response to your question, I think the big thing at the moment is the way we've got quite a lot of comings and goings
Mm.
in the different leadership groups, people changing roles, new people coming in. I have my little staffing folder in my email, and I seem to be putting 6 or 8 emails in that folder every day. There just seems to be so much happening. So we've just appointed someone to pick up the Europe and Caribbean director role from Mark Mennel. So helping Andy get started is a big focus. We have a young guy in Latin America, Esteban, not yet 30.
Mhm.
Everything he does well.
Mhm.
And this year we're moving him into a whole new set of responsibilities in different areas, and helping him get started, and seeing him start to make a contribution. These are the things that um, fill my imagination and heart. And when I look at the work overall, it's those kinds of stories that come to mind. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Just I know you've got some extraordinary foundational plans and structures and manuals and information that you give to and mentor these folk with. But I think the interesting thing that people mightn't be aware is that you have a fairly structured approach as to how you want these small groups to grow and become self-sustaining and independent. And can you talk us through how that's going and what that sort of looks like when you're working it through?
Yeah, well, I think the whole indigenous value is something that permeates all of Langham. I think there's a real sense of wanting to see people lead locally without too much input from outside. And um, one of the areas that we're working on at the moment is that for this work to be sustainable, our sense is that at the level of the local preaching movement, so that 117 number,
Hmm.
we really need to move towards them being financially self-sustaining. We don't have a limitless budget, and we think for all sorts of reasons that's a good thing to aim at. And because the work tends to be small, lots of smalls, rather than something big, that's a goal that I think can be reached. And so we're working towards that. So one thing that is a real focus for us this year in that particular area is we have these annual forums where we gather about 30 people from across our work together and identify an issue of significance for the work globally and try and progress it together over a week. And
Hmm.
so this year,
Hmm.
the Global Forum in June is on this whole area of helping our local preaching movements to be financially self-sustaining. And that's what we're going to look at for a week. And hopefully over the next few years under God's good hand, that's a goal that we'll be able to reach.
That sounds exciting. I mean, because independence and local accountability and stuff does sort of
Mm.
crystallize around that kind of picture. Just for our edification, I know it'll differ from movement to movement, from country to country, but do you have in any way a sort of sterling amount, GBP amount? That you think there's a threshold to sustainability in some of those groups. Mhm.
Oh, yeah, it would vary a lot.
Mhm.
Um, some walk into self-sustaining quite easily from the beginning. Others are very still dependent, but also making their contributions. You got things like churches providing facilities free of charge, or um, people within the network providing meals during the training. So there's lots of ways that the support comes in. I don't know if I could give a figure to that, John.
Okay. I'm just thinking if there's someone around the screen thinking, gosh, I'd love to sponsor a preaching movement in its early days. Is this
Yeah,
a 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20, 30, 50,000 sort of thing? I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is the place for them to do that, but I'm just, to give people an idea, a sense
yeah.
of.
I think it would vary too much, but it would be closer to the kind of thousand figure a year than any of the other figures, yeah, that you mentioned. Yeah. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Um, So again, that's a sort of descriptive bit for us. Thanks very much indeed. And something of your heart comes through, which is exciting. But as you look around, what's the bit that gives you the most excitement? As you meet together in June, what would be the thing that would set that meeting alive? And that,
Mhm. Well, I think there's little stories that are very exciting. I remember last year, in the early days, all the training was done by people who had come from the US or the UK, Australia, New Zealand. It was all, external people. We don't really have that need now. And I remember finding real joy in the same week. Um, one Pakistani was going to Sri Lanka to help with the training, and another Pakistani was going to the Philippines to help with the training. That to me captured something very special. Kesser, who you had a few months ago,
yeah.
was in the Philippines, and then Dr. Asif John was in Sri Lanka. That to me, at so many levels,
Mm.
is exciting to see that kind of thing happening. I think another thing coming up that is really important for the movement as a whole, all of Langham, is that in May, Riyadh Kassis is
Mm.
calling a meeting of the leadership groups of all three programs, 4 days together. And remarkably, that's never happened before.
Mm.
And very few of us know the other groups very well. And I think in terms of 2025 and the work of the programs, I think that will stand out as potentially a very, very significant event as we look to be more intentional about our collaboration together across the programs.
Mhm. What about I mean, there's the a lot of positive and excitement and stuff. What's the thing that worries you, or that you really want wisdom and answers to, that we can join you in prayer?
Yeah, I think it's probably two sides of the same thing. I think it comes back to people.
Mhm.
I think the great joys in the work are watching people grow and develop. Um, but at the same time, all our people are stretched. Um, even in the last few days, hearing words like overwhelmed more than once. We're very dependent on volunteers who give so much time and commitment. But those that are involved in some way on our staff, usually just small portions of their week, they're all overcommitted. They're all giving much more. And as I sit in my place, I don't know what to do about that.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
I think at one level it's wrong and unfair. At another level, it's kind of what happens. But trying to support people and give them the resources they need in a realistic way, I think is a real challenge. Mm.
mm, mm. Yes, it's how do you mentor people that have a depth of commitment and then
Mm.
not layer on too much that it insults their, or yeah, yeah. Um, so your you mentioned your global leadership team, a link to this. How often do you meet? And presumably mainly by Zoom.
Yeah, so we excuse me, we have a monthly Zoom, and we've always structured it.
Mm,
The first hour is praying and sharing and reading things together and more the investment in the team. And then the second hour is more business. So that's the structure that we follow on a monthly basis. And then every year we have about a week together in person. And there's a similar balance to that week as well. About half of the week would be really focused on business, if you like, and the other half would be more on the relational, social side. And I think this has been a value, if you like, that has seeped through the ministry. I was reading yesterday an appraisal document where the person was talking about how the teams of which they're a part of, they're all good friends. And and I've always loved what Dwi over in Asia, how she expressed her team meetings once to me. She says it's like a family reunion. And so I think we find it important to keep investing and making time for that kind of dynamic to develop and to deepen as well.
we'll break into groups very shortly. First of all, is I think already in the chat box, uh, the things that you have mentioned are up there for us. But the thing that we haven't just talked about just before we go into the groups is, what about for you personally, both in role and family and Barbie, and just is there anything on your heart that you might like to share with us for our prayers tonight? Yeah.
Well, I think being involved in Langham, having been impacted by John Stott at such an early age, I've always felt it was kind of a pinch me privilege to be involved. I don't think I've ever lost that. I'm into my 17th year.
Mm,
Uh, so I think there's a real sense of gratitude to God for calling me into this work. I think at a personal level, living in New Zealand is really a challenge. We were in India for 10 years, which was much easier. But
sort of
leading
time
from,
zone and contact and communications
yeah,
one. Yeah. Yeah.
as I say to people in Britain, um, I have to fly 12 hours before I get anywhere. I think from Britain you can fly 12 hours and get get to a lot of places. So I think the
Mm.
demands of the travel, the time zones, all of that means, and I think the isolation. I think when you're in a role like mine, to have so little in-person time with people, you're really dependent on trust and things like that to lead effectively. And I'm always conscious of those sorts of issues from this vantage point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being so candid, and thank you for the inspiration of who you are. And we look forward to holding you and the preaching work in our prayers.